Today, I want to talk about a lesser known secret side of the establishment. It's one of the biggest linchpins, it's one of the biggest foundation stones in the establishment's power structure, how it works, how it runs things, and how it controls society that very few know. Alex knows this, he's covered it for many years, but I want to talk about how the elite families, the oligarchs that still run our country and our world today, or at least most of it, how they actually made their money, because few know this. People think, oh, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and they sold their cogs and their widgets at the factories because they were such hard workers. And no. I'm talking about the elite families of the eastern seaboard of the American establishment and of the British Empire. How did they make their money? Oh, they sold a bunch of tea. They went and through their colonies, they got tea and spices. No, that does not give you the leverage that would equate to more than the wealth of even BlackRock today. What other thing? You might say, oh, human trafficking. No, not even that. Even more valuable than that. And not only did this become a key element to make the Council of 300 of the British East India Company fabulously wealthy, something else happened to make them this actually became an element of warfare. The oligarchs of the West gained their power and their money through drug running. Did you know that drugs are still the staple of the world economy? That's what the dollar is actually based on. Few people know this, but it was actually uncovered many years ago in one of the first big 9/11 books. It's the book that was written about crossing the Rubicon. I read that book back in 2004 or 5 about the rise of the opium dollar post 9/11. Opium, and after the invasion of Afghanistan, the drug trade exploded. And few people connected this to not just 9/11, but also to the global war on terror and to the control of black markets. Now, again, black markets, we think of things like human trafficking. We think of, which again is a terrible, real thing going on in the world. We've got movies like the recent Jim Caviezel movie, Sound of Freedom, that exposes a lot of that. But even bigger than that black market, again, is the drug trade. And we know about the 20th century elite. We've covered the Milner Circle, the Fabians. We've covered the Cecil Rhodes and Lord Rothschild, and we've covered the way that the British Empire was sort of co-opted. But we didn't really get into the means and the mechanisms of how that occurred prior to those days of the late 1890s and so forth. Let's go back to the 1800s. There were actually chartered companies. Again, you go back even further to the British East India Company. And the founding of the British East India Company at first had to do with various privateers and people given a license and a charter to kind of go out and chart and obtain things for the crown. So if you were licensed, if you had a charter, that meant you worked for the crown. You had the approval of the crown to do that. And actually, some of the most famous pirates were actually licensed chartered privateers. When you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, we actually just rewatched that, my wife and I didn't realize, I'd forgotten how crucial to the plot, especially part 2 and 3, the British East India Company becomes. And a lot of that, I mean, it's goofy, right? It's got, gods and goddesses, and it's got Jack Sparrow, Im Broke, right? You've got these Caribbean goddesses like Calypso, but beyond all the kind of goofy stuff, there's actually a pretty deep esoteric plot going on with the British East India Company basically trying to create a global monopoly of the trade, controlling the sea lanes. And that's actually what they did. The British Navy became very effective at this because really the Crown, which eventually took over the British East India Company, adopted all of these trade routes and lanes that were drug trade routes that the British East India Company had set up, and they were making at that time just outlandish amounts of money. It was unbelievable. Nothing had ever been seen like this in the history of the world, at least if you tried to scale it out, in terms of the wealth that was being made through the global opium trade from the British East India Company. The British East India Company also had a very shall we say, Malthusian and Darwinian perspective on how to dominate the world. And seafaring empires, Britain being the classic example, versus land empires or land-based nations. This is the classic kind of geopolitical way to sketch out what different nations are how they function. Seafaring nations function on the basis of monetarism and merchant trade. And land-based nations are typically, or empires are married to the land. And so they have a very different idea of culture, of what is valuable, of law and so forth. Thus, you could see, because of the sort of churning nature of the sea and the oceans, the sort of chaotic elements of the ocean and the trade that's constantly going on, that kind of an empire would be much more susceptible to things like wild levels of usury and wild levels of monetarism. And so the British Empire became very adept at this. It became, in my view, pretty much a front for a lot of these elite oligarchical families. And by the 1800s, they had really consolidated this power. And when the British East India Company was in decline, the Crown just took it over. They took over all of the dominions and the ships. They already had these colonies, but they had a deal with the British East India Company, which really, again, was identical to the British Empire. And so the Crown took it over, and still, I believe, exerts a lot of influence and power in terms of the Royal Society, the Royal Institute for National Affairs, and these elite bodies that still to this day have a lot of power and influence in, obviously in the world, but specifically also in terms of the drug trade, as well as many big banks that were set up to be basically big drug laundering banks. This is how our world really runs. This is how it really functions. This is the Alex Jones Show. Don't go anywhere. We're going to get deeper into the secret intelligence networks and the drug trade behind the New World Order. Jay's analysis, we're talking about the history of the international drug trade, particularly the opium empire that was built up by the British East India Company, which was later taken over by the Crown. And these same people, of course, allied themselves with the elites in the 1800s in the United States of America. So in other words, we've been under this shadow oligarchical drug empire without even knowing it. And in fact, this isn't just covered by people like Dr. John Coleman in his Committee of 300 book. It's also covered in the history of America's secret establishment, Anthony Sutton's book on the history of the Order of Skull and Bones, which would later produce the OSS and the CIA. So people out of Skull and Bones at Yale, or who were the early recruits and continue to be recruits into the OSS and the CIA. And he talks about, for example, early on in the book, the power structure, how it worked in terms of this concentric circles of power. You would have people at Skull and Bones. This is in the 1800s principally, right? So you would have the order, you would have the White House, the executive branch. It would influence that. Foundations and think tanks would be influenced. The Federal Reserve System would be influenced by it. The banking, the industrial complex, law, education, media, and also churches. So the perspective of the oligarchs here was society-wide. It was all of society. And again, they had adopted for a long time the attitude of Malthusianism, depopulation, and total control. Now, this circle also, in terms of today, according to Sutton, functions in a similar way with groups like Bilderberg, the Trilateral Commission, Bohemian Club, the Atlantic Council, and he places Skull and Bones as one of the key elements there. It's not the totality, it's not everything, but it's one of the key elements in the power structure, ultimately that would be aligned with the British elite structure and the founding of the OSS and the CIA. And the strategy of tension that they adopted a long time ago is a Hegelian philosophy. It's a thesis, antithesis, synthesis model where you put intentional stressors and shocks on the society, on the system, to demoralize it and to collapse it. It doesn't have to be right away. It can be a slow kill Fabian model, or it can be a right away model. We might even see in the next 12 months, things get really crazy. Dr. Sutton gives an analogy, a little chart here where he says that the way that they functioned in the 20th century was to have the thesis of Marxism and the antithesis of fascism. And together, this clashing, as well as Western capitalism, produces the desired long-term synthesis here of a future third way technocratic order between Bolshevism, fascism, and capitalism. So you have to, in their philosophy, clash these things together, right? Kind of like what Samuel P. Huntington writes about in The Clash of Civilizations. It's not just two economic systems. You clash, for example, Christianity against Islam. You clash all of these things together, these different systems. Eastern communism versus Western capitalism, clash them together in the Cold War, because they think that this is a necessary process of history, process philosophy. The idea is that, well, doesn't this occur in nature, right? The survival of the fittest. The one that's the fittest, the product of this of the clashing in terms of biology is the synthesis. And so they would view this as just fundamental to nature itself. Biology, they believe, teaches you that good and evil are relative principles founded in and grounded in the natural order, and its clashing of things together to produce whatever the synthesis they want. Now, if we go back to an example of this in the 80s, Dr. John Coleman, in his book on the Committee of 300, which again is another study on this institution and this power structure in the West that comes out of these 1800s era oligarchical drug families, he says that gang wars were actually planned at Stanford University. That is the same Stanford that produces Changing Images of Man, all the white papers, SRI, all of that, and Tavistock. They deliberately designed the shocks to society that caused the ripples of disturbances. By 1958, there were in excess 200 of these gangs. They were made popular by various Hollywood movies, musicals, things like West Side Story. Although I don't think today's gangs want to classify themselves as the Sharks and the Jets, although that would be pretty funny. In 1966, they began to increase throughout the near decade of gang violence. The public reacted according to the profile response of Stanford research, as they expected. Society would then not comprehend gang warfare, and they adapted to it in a maladaptive response model. This is the Tavistock model of not just thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but shocking the system and basically traumatizing the masses to put them into a maladaptive dissociative state. This is in their own documents, their own psychology. So gang wars produce the fragmentation of society. Society then reacts with a maladaptive dissociative response. So this is studied and designed this way. It's not just all chaos and one damn thing after another. When the intelligence agencies work with various gangs, like the 80s, I lived in California in the 80s. I remember the Crips and the Bloods and the gang wars and all this kind of stuff. And what will we do? How will we stop the drugs? We'll have a drug war. We'll have a war on gangs and violence. All of that was window dressing because the establishment is involved in steering and engineering the gangs. Freeway Ricky Ross, remember him talking about how the crack cocaine epidemic was actually fostered by the establishment and the intelligence agencies. They would work with certain cartels, work with certain gangs. Think about Pablo Escobar as another example. And this is amazing because everything that Dr. John Coleman had written in 1992 in his book actually is the same stuff that later came out with various journalists and people exposing the complicity of the intelligence agencies in the drug trade. 1989, gang warfare as a social conditioning model to change was introduced into the streets of Los Angeles. Within a few short months, the first incidents of gangs began to proliferate. This led to crack houses and rampant prostitution, which proliferated. Drug dealers then dominated the streets, and anybody who got in their way was gunned down. The outcry of the press was loud and long. Stanford research targeted large population groups and defended itself with slogans. This is what Tavistock called the first phase of the targeted group failing to identify the source of the crisis. So you think that it's teenage lack of education. We need more social programs. Failing to recognize that the problem was at the top itself. And this is always what happens. And this is why the whole country is collapsing and going to garbage and trash, because nobody identifies the actual problems. It's always a deflection and concerned with, it's the libs, it's the incompetency in the government, never failing to understand that it's a technocratic social engineering plan from the top down. It's not incompetence. There's a layer of government incompetence that covers up for the psychopathic layer of the elite control specter level organizations that are behind this stuff. He goes on to say that the gang war crisis implemented a fragmentation in society that Stanford Research and Tavistock intended to be the case through their maladaptive process and the period that resulted in dissociation afterwards. So again, what happens to an individual in terms of trauma can be applied to society as a whole.
I want to show off something that we're all proud of. I got a browser here. This is Jay Dyer's much vaunted, much sought after Philosophy 101. Now, he just got this page up. We are just testing it out. You guys are some of the first people in the world to see it. I want to say, for my part, it's not Philosophy 101. I think this is a mistitling. I really think of it as like Philosophy Unleashed, because a Philosophy 101 course, they give you kind of some useless information that you can't make sense of. Jay actually lays out over 12 weeks, dozens and dozens of hours put into just the presentation of this, let alone the hundreds and thousands of hours of research that it takes to have a coherent evolution and history of the origins of philosophy, the uses of philosophy, the different ways to look at it over time, and how that has been brought about to what we have today, which is almost an absence of philosophy on the objective logic and reason side, and an overabundance of woke philosophy that is irrational, is made up day by day as people are like, I think we should bring racism back. And then here's a justification. And then it gets wokeified and spread out. And then all of a sudden you have a bunch of communist, socialist ideas where you become the property in action. You need to be able to stand your own ground. It helps to have a foundation in philosophy because it's a method to find truth. When you get down to it, philosophy is there because you love truth enough to go and learn how to find it because it's valuable. So if you're interested in things like that, there is the landing page. We'll link it up in the notes. It is a longer one, so we'll get a shorter URL for this. I'm sure Jay has a link on his page. I just wanted to show it off. Now you know it exists. You can go look for it and see why this is not your father's philosophy, right? So well done. I'm proud of everyone who helped to produce and edit the course. And of course, Jay did a flawless job in presenting the course over those 12 weeks. And he's a juggernaut. He's another guy, just like John Bush, in action all the time, doing something productive, like very little wasted time in his week. Those 168 hours of being harnessed very well.
Engineered shock and stress are put on the system as a kind of research project by the technocratic elite. And this is not surprising because the same thing occurred a few generations earlier in the 1960s counterculture revolution, which initially I think had a lot of organic support, but was eventually, perhaps even from the outset, really fostered and steered by the establishment into promoting mass drug use, LSD, and mind control projects and experiments from the top down. And we cover this in detail when we, a few months ago here on the Fourth Hour, we got into depth with various Aldous Huxley books, who was one of the key ideologues, figures, and members of the elite power structure who was behind the push of this 1960s counterculture. He was kind of the high priest of their psychedelic Dionysian cult. Other people like Allen Ginsberg and Timothy Leary played key roles as psychonauts for the establishment pushing all of these drugs. And so we saw in the 1960s a mass change in society, a vast cultural revolution that wasn't organic ultimately, but was steered by the establishment and had top-down promotion even as high as Time Life magazine, when Henry Luce of Skull and Bones, the promoter and owner of Time Life magazine, when he started promoting Gordon Wasson and the Magic Mushroom on the cover of Time magazine. So what supposedly was counterculture was being pushed by the top of the establishment itself. And this had to do with a lot of British influence in terms of Far Eastern philosophies that were being pushed in the West by design through a lot of these institutes and steering committees and think tanks. And also the Laurel Canyon scene and all of its intelligence and deep state connections in terms of the bands and the music and the 60s culture that was being pushed out of that scene. That was actually the original scene prior to Haight-Ashbury. And when we look at the various big pharmaceutical companies like Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, which was the means by which LSD was pushed out in the 1960s, that was the company that was basically tasked by the OSS and CIA with producing this new synthesized hallucinogen. Books like Dope Inc. and books like Committee of 300 by Dr. John Coleman had long ago discussed this model of cultural warfare. Drugs are not just things that bad guys do and sell to make money. Drugs are a tool for social control, and it's not a new idea. That's what I'm trying to express to you. This is an old strategy that the British oligarchs figured out when they would import this to China intentionally. Eventually, the Chinese government was noticing these devastating effects on their people, and they started to try to ban it, but they couldn't ban it because the British would just use fake Christian mission cutouts, like the Inland Christian Mission, which was a front that the British used for the pushing of opium under the guise of being Christian missionaries, by the way. These fronts and these organizations and the clipper ships that they had, the Chinese just couldn't stop these, and they couldn't stop the smuggling. And so these are the predecessors to what would become later on the intelligence agencies. And that's because these smugglers and these Navy men and these pirates, you could say, got really adept at how to smuggle and how to be effective in their ops when it came to bringing drugs and then also people, human trafficking, into various countries and out of various countries. These lanes, that would be the Golden Triangle, the Golden Crescent, these various regions, it became a very standardized, systematized, and amazingly logistical projects about how they would ship opium from different regions and different countries, the refining process, and then how that money would be paid only in gold and how it would go through certain banks, and then it would be shipped to certain countries and sold. And sometimes the countries where it was shipped and sold was done as part of warfare. Warfare is not just tanks and bombs and guns. Warfare is also economic. It's also cultural. It's social. It's also religious. It's ideological. Warfare is total. And the oligarchs and elites of the 1700s and the 1800s knew this very well. In fact, the elites knew this thousands of years ago. But the perfecting of the use of drugs as a form of warfare became very precise and scientific, you could even argue, in the 1800s, when you had a lot of these very powerful, wealthy families in the UK, in Europe, France as well, and in the United States, such as the Astors. The Astors made tremendous wealth, supposedly under the guise, John Jacob Astor, of selling pelts. Now, you don't become fabulously wealthy by just selling beaver pelts, although I know the beaver pelt market is huge. You stack stacks for selling opium underneath all of them beaver pelts, right? What's under your beaver? Opium, baby, not more beavers. It's not beavers all the way down. It's opium all the way down. And that, again, this is the model of the British East India Company. In fact, the Council of 300, which Dr. Coleman argues is actually the predecessor to the Royal Institute for International Affairs and what he calls the Committee of 300, which is really the top 300 elite.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure and take use of the promo code for the show sponsor, for this channel sponsor, which is choq.com. That's CHOQ.com. You can find the links in the description below the video. You get 50% off any of the great organic, actually better than organic supplements that they offer at choq.com. If you want to support my channel, the best way to do that is to head on over there and use that promo code J50, that's J50, to get 50% off. You can also use the recurring subscription of J53 Life, that's J53LIFE, if you want to sign up for automatic recurring subscriptions on those excellent supplements. Health is absolutely necessary in combating the toxic culture that we live in. I also would say if you want to get access to my books, head on over to the shop at my website and get signed copies there. Thank you.
International Affairs and what he calls the Committee of 300, which is really the top 300 elite globalists, people like Kissinger and Brzezinski and these characters. they had sent envoys basically to American oligarchs to introduce the wealthier American oligarchical families in the 1800s to this process and how it occurs and how you do it. So when you're watching movies like Pirates of the Caribbean, of all things, and you're watching the second one and the third one, you'll notice that the British East India Company is the ultimate villain of that plot, of that narrative, because they were really trying to establish this monopoly. It's not really mentioned in the movie, but what do you think they were moving in all of these fast clipper ships and all of these amazingly designed battleships? It wasn't just human slaves, although the British East India Company did eventually have, I think, a monopoly on human slave trade as well. They were moving drugs, they were moving opium. And it became a very scientifically ordered process, again, of every step of how you do this. Now, as we get into the 20th century, this doesn't really change after the Crown takes over the British East India Company, I think in the 1800s. The process, all of this still continues, and the advancement of technology and the advancement of, how ships advance and become more sophisticated and all of that, shipping lanes, it just continues, and the refining process gets more and more scientific and sophisticated. In fact, Dr. Coleman links a lot of famous deaths, such as Grace Kelly, who was married to the Prince Rainier of Monaco, that this was a hit on her due to the Prince Rainier not going along with all of what the elites in Europe and the Committee of 300 had planned for taking over the global drug trade. Now, they already had a tremendous influence, but they didn't have, for example, all the Latin and South American cocaine trade under their grips. There were various cartels in Colombia and Bolivia, places like that were not fully under the control of the Western power elite. And so a lot of times when you see the drug war going into effect, say in the 1980s and the 1990s, Dr. Coleman argues that Manuel Noriega was taken out by Bush precisely because he was getting in the way of some of what the Western intelligence agencies had planned for the drug trade. Doesn't mean Noriega was a good guy. In fact, he was put in there by the CIA and was intended to be a puppet, just like Saddam. But they don't always do as they're told, and sometimes they go off script. And then you get a regime change, or in his case, you get extradited and kidnapped. He argues that David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, for example, came up with the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and this was to basically control the marijuana trade out of the Caribbean Basin. This is also, again, modeled on the older British East India Company model that even people like Rudyard Kipling wrote about when he wrote about the empire in his novels and their speedy clipper ships, the tea clippers. They weren't just in how the oligarchs that run the Western world in the 1800s had really amassed their power and their fortunes that enabled them to continue in their dynastic succession to have their committees, their steering groups, their working groups still to have the power to run, or most of, if not the entire world, or at least they're still working on that. And in fact, you're going to start to see, hey, wait a minute, drug networks, drug lines, drug war, drug companies. Maybe we're still under the same oligarchical structure. Big pharmaceutical companies are today's British East India Company. They're today's Committee of 300 or Council of 300. Council of 300 was the 300 people on the board, you could say, of the British East India Company. That became the structure and the model for the later Royal Society, Royal Institute for International Affairs, higher level steering committees, Society of the Elect, and the Committee of 300. During the Opium Wars, Hong Kong became key for the UK oligarchical elite to control the drug trade throughout China. In fact, this war against China, he says, was designed to put the Chinese in their place, according to Lord Palmerston himself. The British Army, in fact, did just that, with these oligarchical feudal lords making untold billions in the process. This left China with millions of opium addicts, even up into the era of the bloody rule of Mao Zedong, who, as we know, was a Yale in China. Initially, as we said, the Chinese government opposed this and tried to figure out ways to stop this because it was decimating their people. Eventually, however, they decided that rather than try to fight it, it's much more profitable to go in league with the British oligarchical elite and to share in the opium trade. This continued even into, according to Coleman, the communist period. The major problem that arose in the Sino-British relations in the last 60 years concerned China's demand for a larger slice of the opium heroin pie. This was settled when Britain agreed to hand over Hong Kong to the Chinese government. That will eventually come into effect in the future. Now, again, it's kind of unclear for me, from my vantage point, as to see exactly what Taiwan and all that relationship is. But I kind of think that it relates to the drug trade. And a lot of people don't talk about that. A lot of people in libertarian circles, right, they want to defend the Western, base there against China. And I'm not saying that I'm just saying it's a little more complex than just good guy versus bad guy. A lot of what's going on there relates to the drug trade. And Coleman goes on to say that the oligarchical families that comprise the Committee of 300 are entrenched in Canton and have been since the height of the opium trade, and they've left their descendants in these positions. If you look at the list of prominent British residents in China, you will find many of them among these higher committees of the Western elite structure. The same holds for Hong Kong. The plutocrats of the feudal era would like to return the world to a feudal society. When it comes to gold and the opium trade, Hong Kong is the center. Burmese and Chinese opium growers get paid in gold because they do not trust the U.S. paper $100 bills. This is why so much gold is traded on the Hong Kong exchange. The Golden Triangle is no longer, however, the largest producer of opium. That title has changed since 1987 and is now shared by the Golden Crescent of Iran, Pakistan, and Lebanon. And this relates also to Afghanistan and Turkey. And so he argues that a lot of these corporations, a lot of these entities that he's writing this, remember, in 1992, and none of this has really changed. In fact, a lot of the biggest banks out there are clearinghouses, he argues, for the drug trade. So the very secretive banks like the Vatican Bank or like the Bank for International Settlements, these are actually gigantic drug clearing banks, according to Dr. Coleman. So it's a giant global empire and a global business. And that's what most people don't understand about this structure. And again, if you think about this, it makes perfect sense, though, with how we're run today by giant pharmaceutical conglomerates that are able to push and foist a gigantic alteration in the world's daily operating system. Suddenly, we're all told that we have to wear masks and we all have to stand 6 feet apart from one another, and then we have to take our masks off and then we have to put them back on. And that's the power of this superstructure here. Now, it's not just about making money. That's a part of it. But the elite drug trade is just one of the weapons in the arsenal of the establishment. And as I said earlier, it's also a key part of social engineering. Now, if we start to think about fentanyl and the drug crisis in America, Dr. Coleman even talks about studies that the elite have about how when the economy gets worse and worse and worse, more people turn to drugs. And in fact, this is the goal, to eventually have people broke, homeless, you'll own nothing, you'll have nothing, but you'll also be given the drugs that the system will legalize. Eventually, he argues, the plan is to legalize every drug, and then corporate conglomerates will have a monopoly when they're allowed to have the government charter to sell the drugs. Not just weed or not just alcohol, but all of the drugs, including the hardest drugs. Eventually, when society is degenerated and demoralized enough, will all be legalized at the right point in time, when it's ripe for this harvest, to eventually get the population drugged into becoming mindless zombies. Now, we already have a giant portion of the population that is a bunch of mindless zombies, but the plan here is eventually to have the legalization of all of these things as a mass social engineering warfare, culture war project. Because when people don't have work And when they don't have jobs, when they don't have things to do, they will turn to not just alcohol, but pill forms of all of these things. And we already see people doing this. When you go to the biggest cities in America, and I've been to all of them, not all of them, but I've been to many of them from coast to coast, LA and so forth, Austin, over the last 4 or 5 years, you start to notice these giant hordes of people that are now fentanyl zombies and homeless people roaming the streets. Even in small towns, we're beginning to see that. And it's only going to get worse because this is not a problem of low-level drug dealers, of guys coming over the border. Now, that is part of the problem. They do bring the drugs in, but this is not run by low-level people crossing the border. This is run by some of the wealthiest people on the planet. And because no one can figure that out and no one thinks to figure that out, it never changes. It just marches forward. And this also ties into the intelligence agencies and how they took over these drug lanes after World War II, especially. This also ties into a lot of the interviews that I've done with the mafia figures and organized crime, because they were involved with working with the intelligence agencies and these various groups to actually be one of the middlemen in this refining and exportation process, right? The organized crime figures, as well as street gangs, right, were key elements in this giant business, this big superstructure international business. Think of it like an international corporation. That's how the drug business is run. And that's why it's never stopped. And that's why it keeps going. And that's why ultimately it's not even black markets. Nowadays, it's becoming normalized markets because the big pharmaceutical companies are legal drug pushers by design, because it's the top elite families that run it and they're above the law. And people like Kissinger and Brzezinski strategize and know and understand this history and how the black markets do this, because the world is run by these people. It's not run by Joe Biden. It's not run by the people that you elect. It's run by inner party groups like the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And when you go and read the people that run and research and write public books from the RIIA, like Mark Curtis, who wrote the famous book Secret Affairs, The History of Britain's Collusion with Radical Islam, Mark Curtis of the Royal Institute for International Affairs says that this is a tool of the Western power structure of these people. I'm talking about radical Islam and their push for all kinds of strategy of tension, shock models, right? Just another example, just another weapon in the arsenal. And we've talked about this at length as well in the past shows. And so you can go back and watch those. They're all on band.video or on my channel. You can go to my website and get my book, 660-page book, all of my geopolitical and theological philosophy essays. You can subscribe to my website. You can get my old Hollywood books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2, at my website. You can also follow me on Rockfin, which is a great free speech-based platform. Subscribe to me there on Rockfin. You can follow me on YouTube under my name, Jay Dyer. Also, be sure to go to the InfoWar store and get those excellent products to support Alex and the InfoWar